The Melbourne Symphony Orchestra respectfully acknowledges the traditional custodians of this land, the people of the Eastern Kulin Nation. On this unceded land, we celebrate the oldest continuous music practice in the world. In our language of music, we honour this country and celebrate the strength of elders past and present as we walk together into our shared future.
Good evening. My name's Olivia Ball. I'm a councillor from Melbourne City Council. Thank you so much for that beautiful acknowledgement. We are so proud at the City of Melbourne to be able to help make music more accessible and available. Like last Wednesday night at Sydney Myer Music Bowl, 35 degrees, 10,000 people came out to hear the symphony play on Wednesday night. It was spectacular because Melburnians love music, and it's wonderful to have these free opportunities and also educational opportunities like tonight. This wonderful series, Ears Wide Open, here at this beautiful recital centre and live streaming right now. It's a wonderful way to introduce someone to classical music and to enhance our appreciation and enjoyment of music. I'm especially pleased tonight that this program is in the week of International Women's Day, celebrating the composer Clara Schumann, who wrote this piano concerto at the age of 14. Of course, she went on to become Clara Schumann, and maybe she would have written more concerti had she had a composing room of one's own. She had trouble even getting her piano from her overbearing father when she left home to get married. And she went on to bear 8 children and raise them along with some of her grandchildren. She was the primary breadwinner for her household as an internationally renowned concert pianist. And I dare say, and Ingrid will correct me if I'm leaping to conclusions, I dare say Robert Schumann would not be the celebrated composer we know and enjoy today had she not done all of that and edited, played and promoted his music tirelessly till the end of her days. If you have heard Origo before, you'll know we're in for such a treat tonight. This year's theme for International Women's Day is Invest in Women. And I applaud the MSO for investing in all the outstanding women who will grace this stage this evening. I hope to see you back here very soon for anything the Symphony is doing, Melbourne's own orchestra, and do bring a friend. Thank you very much.
Those were the first notes of Concertsatz, or concert piece, composed by Clara Wieck at the age of 13. Over the course of 3 years, she would transform it into what is now her piano concerto. Tonight, we're going to discover the history behind this work, the building blocks that make it up, and why its young composer was a trailblazer of her time. Good evening, my name is Ingrid Martin, and welcome to Ears Wide Open. We're grateful to our Ears Wide Open presenting partner Tarrawarra Estate, and also to the City of Melbourne, Crown Resorts Foundation, and Packer Family Foundation for their support of these wonderful events. Despite her youth, by the time Clara Wieck wrote this piece, she was already a fully fledged piano virtuoso, and this piece was designed to show off her exceptional technique. Today, to demonstrate both Clara's musicianship and her own, can we please welcome to the piano Aura Go. To share this music with you, we of course need the wonderful musicians of the MSO, led today by Jen Winley. Now, before we dive into the music, I want to take a poll. Before you booked tickets to tonight's concert, hands up if you were familiar with the name Schumann. Good. And what about Clara Schumann? Good. Keep your hand up if you knew that she was a pianist. Couldn't keep it up if you knew she was also a composer. Well, a few hands went down then. And keep your hand up if you knew that she'd written a piano concerto for piano and orchestra. Yes, less hands up, I can see. Funnily enough, if we had taken this poll in the 1830s, it would have looked quite different. Now, Clara is probably best known for being the wife of composer Robert Schumann, but back then, she was the famous one. In fact, when they went on holidays around Europe, he was referred to as the husband of Clara Wieck. During tonight's show, we're going to give you some background on the overall structure of the piece and how it came to be. Then we'll look at each of the 3 movements in turn. For each one, we'll pull it apart, highlight some special details before playing it in full. To understand what made Clara and her concerto so famous, we need to understand how it evolved. Clara was raised in an unusual middle-class family. Her father, Friedrich, despite coming from very modest means, became a piano tutor before building a successful business renting and selling instruments in Leipzig, Germany. Shortly after settling there, he married the up-and-coming pianist and singer Marianne Tomlitz. It was fair to say Friedrich was obsessed with teaching. He'd studied pedagogy and created his own method, so it was probably no surprise that even before his first child was born, he had decided that regardless of their gender, they would become a famous artist. Now, this was at a time when young women received very little formal education, and if they did, it probably stopped when they got to the beginning of puberty. Though there were a handful of young women who were being brought up to be musical prodigies, it certainly wasn't the norm. Having a mother who in her own right was a successful musician must certainly have contributed to both Friedrich and Clara's belief that women could be more than just housewives. By age 13, when she'd begun to compose this piece, she was already a busy touring pianist. The concerto as we know it now has 3 movements: fast, slow, fast. But like many pieces, it wasn't written in that order. Young Clara started writing her Concertsatz, or concert piece, in 1833. She wrote all the orchestra parts herself before asking her then friend, Robert Schumann, to re-orchestrate it for her. This became what is now the 3rd movement of the concerto. Over the next 2 years, she composed the other two movements and undid all of Robert's orchestrations before the piece was finished on the 1st of September 1835, just 12 days before her 16th birthday. Knowing this order, that the last movement was actually written first, is important because it helps us understand why the music sounds the way it does. One of the interesting features of this piece is that it has really only one theme, one tune. It's monothematic. Let's hear the first tune that she wrote. It's what you heard at the very beginning, the beginning of what is now the third movement. Listen for how the music goes up in pitch before coming back down again. So she wrote this music first, then she tackled the second movement. Keeping that up and down contour, she transformed the determined dance-like music into a romantic, wistful song. That brings us to the first movement. Like the third, it's more robust and grand, but it's still a version of that up and down shape. You can hear that up and down motion is really like the genetic code of this music, the DNA, if you will. It infuses just about every bar of the entire piece. Let's now look at each of the movements in detail. In the first movement, once the orchestra has given that brief introduction that you just heard, it's over to the piano, immediately demonstrating power and drama. And again, that rising and falling is never far away. Now it's time for the piano to transform what the orchestra played into a truly romantic version. Friedrich Wieck, her father's piano training was unique, drawing from many different methods. But what was most important to him was that his daughter's playing wasn't just technical, it was expressive and musical. In the 1830s, there was a craze of young prodigies who were met with indifference by audiences. Yet, the audiences also found them fascinating if they could play really well whilst still looking like small children. Perhaps not much has changed. Even in 1832, as an astute promoter, Friedrich knew that hot-housed young musicians could carry a bad reputation. He wrote, "Everyone avoids the so-called prodigies, who have usually had a few pieces drummed into them, but who are not musical." His dream of helping Clara become a true consummate artist is best summed up by his teaching mantra. The artist's first rule is that skill is a tool, but your art's put to shame if skill is the aim. Clara wasn't a musician who just learned pieces by rote. By the time she had started composing this concerto, she'd already had extensive training in improvisation, singing, ear training, and violin, in addition to the piano. As a soloist at that time, she was expected to have her own concerto and own original works to perform. Thus, woven into the fabric of this piece is the need to show both her artistic and technical skill and her musicality. Given that it was written to showcase these abilities, of course you need a section dedicated to showing off your virtuosity. What comes next in the music is called a display episode, and it does just that. Let's hear what the piano has. That is a lot of notes. While that is going on, the orchestra is making sure that you don't forget that opening theme, ba-bum, ba-bum, by playing little snippets underneath. Let's hear just the orchestra. Together, you get all of that piano wizardry while still keeping the main tune firmly in your mind. I think we need to give Aura some more applause for that virtuosity. A bit further along in this first movement, the rising and falling tune creeps back into the piano in the left hand, supported by various instruments in the orchestra. Aura, can we hear just the left hand by itself? let's hear that same spot again, but this time with the entire piano part and the whole orchestra. Listen out for the bassoon, the cellos, the basses, as well as some brief appearances by the oboe and clarinet, together with the left hand of the piano. Now, it's not every day that you get the opportunity to talk to a concert pianist. So, Aura, do you think we could have a chat? Now, I want to know from you, what have you learned about Clara Schumann as a pianist from learning this music?
Well, she was obviously an astonishing pianist. To be not just playing this, but composing this for herself to play at 13 is pretty incredible. I think when we, as pianists or instrumentalists of any instrument, when we encounter music written by composers for their own instruments, and particularly for themselves to perform, it gives us a really special closeness to the composer. We can actually sense them. It's a kind of embodied connection that we have, because Clara Schumann, Clara Wieck at that time, was actually playing those notes. She was making those shapes and patterns. So we actually learn a lot about what she was like as a player. She was also, of course, astonishing. She obviously had a very large hand, which I don't, unfortunately. And she loved certain things that we can see from the repertoire that she enjoyed playing at that time. So, for example, we know that, this is incredible. At the age of 11, her father was very proud of the fact that she had learnt Chopin's Opus 2, the Lacidarem da Mano variations, incredibly difficult, fiendishly difficult work. She had learnt that in 8 days. And there's a lot of technical material in this concerto that we can see, because this was in her repertoire and she was touring that work when she was writing this. So we can actually see a lot of the same sorts of pianistic characteristics in this work, which Chopin later moved away from and found perhaps smarter ways of creating effects, and she also moved away from. But it gives us this snapshot into what she was playing at that time in her life.
And I'm not a pianist. What's hard to play in this piece?
Well, I have a very different physique, particularly in terms of hands, from Clara Schumann, and that's something that we come into contact with composers who wrote music for themselves, and they had different bodies, and playing is an embodied endeavour. So I come into contact with the fact that what she found very easy to do, I don't find easy to do. So it's there's that challenge which happens with all composers, finding a way to inhabit their music and I think in this it's important to inhabit, to kind of imagine what kind of pianism did Clara, did she embody, and how can I do my version of that with what I've got, which is clearly not what she had, unfortunately.
when I was preparing for tonight, I actually found online, you can look up, there's pictures of casts of her hands, and she did indeed have huge hands.
Huge. So all these leaps that she does, they weren't as leapy. Of course, the pianos of the day were also lighter to play, which adds another dimension of difficulty when we're playing on modern concert instruments in big halls. But yes, there are multiple challenges, but it's so satisfying to go through that process of finding that special connection with a composer through their music and thinking, my goodness, they played this instrument and they played these notes, and we're having this conversation across time. It's quite amazing.
Well, should we continue the conversation?
Let's continue.
So there's one last building block I want you to listen out for in this first movement. It's a rolling idea, and you guessed it, it climbs up and up. It happens twice, once near the beginning. The purpose of this little link is to bring us into a new key and alert us that something big is coming. She uses it again near the end. In Western music, one of the most important devices is harmony and the expectations that it sets up. The home base is called the tonic, and in this case, it's A minor. The second most important chord is the dominant, or the away key, E major. What's most important is the relationship between these two keys. The dominant, or the away key, sets up a sense of anticipation. Let's hear that E major again. And it helps us roll into the inevitability that is resolved when we return home to A minor. In this movement, Clara's rolling building block is centered on the dominant, E major, and she uses it to set up a sense of building momentum towards the next big event. What's interesting about this whole movement is that Clara has thrown away the rule book when it comes to structure. Normally, in a first movement of a concerto like this, a composer would present two distinctly different tunes or musical themes, then play around with them, pull them apart, then try out some new keys before putting them back together again in a similar way to how you first heard them. This is called sonata form. But instead, Clara gives us our first idea, and then she's done. She's on to the second movement of the concerto. There's no pulling apart or mucking about. Music nerds call this a unitary exposition. Now, this wasn't a brand new idea, but it wasn't common either. And what we'll continue to see is that what's trailblazing about this piece is just how many unusual ideas Clara combined into one piece in a way that had never been done before. Let's now listen to the entire first movement. So remember to listen for that rising and falling melody, first sternly by the orchestra, followed by the piano's bold entrance, and then the romantic version. If you can, see if you can also spot that rolling link idea that tells us something new is coming. And that brings us to the second movement and more of the young Clara's bold choices. There are no breaks between the movements of this concerto. Each movement runs continuously into the next. Now again, others had done this before her. 20 years earlier, in his famous Emperor Concerto, Beethoven had run the second movement into the third movement. But nevertheless, to do it and between all of the movements was quite progressive indeed. It's especially interesting because, again, she's made another unconventional choice. The first movement we heard is in the key of A minor. It would be customary to then put the second movement in a different but related key, like or, but no. Clara takes us from A minor to A flat major. Now, to our modern ears, these might sound very close, but back in 1833, that was pretty rebellious. So, how does she get from one to the other? How does she smoothly take us from the end of the first movement into the beginning of the second without a break? Let's hear the transition from the first to the second movement again. Our main tune comes back for a last hurrah before two lone instruments, the cello and the clarinet, sing softly. 3 shorter notes moving to a longer one before dissolving into the piano. That beautiful line that you just heard in the cello and clarinet is a prelude to the melody of the second movement, subtitled Romance. The rhythm of short, 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 long is in just about every bar. And there's also that inescapable DNA of rising and falling. But now we're in a totally different world. Cello that brought us into this movement. That was also a clue about what's about to happen, another break with tradition. This movement has no orchestra. It's just the piano, a chance for young Clara to show she wasn't just about technique, but that she could really sing through the instrument. she's not totally alone. By the time she was writing this, Clara, at age 14, had already known Robert Schumann for several years. Not long after this was written, they shared their first kiss. A solo cello is the only other instrument in this movement, and so there's speculation that this cello represents Robert, a symbol of them getting to be together on stage, even in his absence. This device of using a solo cello to accompany a slow movement started a trend. A decade later, Robert, now her husband, used it in his famous piano concerto. Another 40 years after that, Johannes Brahms, with whom Clara became very close, used it in his second piano concerto. But now you know Clara did it first. Let's now listen to the entire sublime second movement, which is the epitome of Friedrich Wieck's teaching that melody and phrasing should sing with immaculate smoothness. Here's Aura and Rachel Tobin on cello. Now, I don't know if you noticed, but Jen was twiddling her thumbs for most of that. So come over and let's have a chat. You can warm yourself back up again.
Thanks, Ingrid.
So I want to know, what's different conducting with a soloist compared to just conducting the orchestra?
Well, it's really special when you get to work with a soloist, especially someone like Aura, who's just so musical and so easy to work with. So you have a collaborator. So as a conductor, you spend a lot of time in your own head and coming up with your interpretations, and of course you share that with the musicians of the orchestra. It is a collaboration there as well. But when you've got someone who is the front and centre, you really get to share your ideas together. And really I see my role as facilitating Aura, or the soloist, to do their best performance and put their interpretation out to the audience, and to also connect them with the orchestra.
And how do you communicate? You know, you're up there waving your hands and the music's going. You can't stop and talk to each other.
Well, eye contact's really important, but actually Aura and I were having a chat earlier about how we like to sense where each other is. Without really having to look, we can sort of just feel where it is. And we were talking about how we like to do that when we're performing. So Aura when she's accompanying, and myself when I'm conducting or performing. It's sort of a felt sense.
Sounds pretty special.
It's a bit woo-woo, but it's real. It's real.
And you do talk before the rehearsal,
We do
don't
talk,
you?
yeah. We do talk as well. Was that what you were leading for?
No. But just there's both of these two parts of the job, because when did you and Aura first meet in person to prepare for this?
This morning at 11. Yeah.
So that ESP is actually really important.
Yeah, and that was actually a real treat to be able to have that much time. Often you've got 15 minutes to have a quick chat about tempi, and then it's really just about sensing what do they need, and you can tell if they're trying to push you or pull you back. But yeah, it was a real treat to be able to have a whole hour to have a chat.
So now you know, audience, next time you come to a concert with a concerto, they maybe got to talk for 15 minutes before putting it all together, and then the senses kick in.
That's right.
Well, I think it's time to give the orchestra some more to do, don't you think? They've been listening so patiently. Genuinely, everyone. So we've now come to the third and the longest movement. Now remember, before we said that all the movements were connected, and that Clara had gotten us into that remote key of A flat major in the Romance. Well, now she's got to get us back to the key we had in the first movement, A minor, and she has to do it seamlessly. Now remember, we talked about our home and our away keys. Well, if home for the final movement is back in A minor, then our away key, just like before, is E major. So Aura and Rachel finish the Romance in A flat. Then in every finger except one, Aura keeps playing the A flat chord. Except for the top note, which keeps creeping up. Till it gets to E flat, which is right next door to E, which is going to be our away key. Well, I just heard something else. It's the timpani. And now the timpani is poised on our away note, E, ready to launch us into the third movement, land us back in A minor with a spirited Polish dance called a Polaka. That tune that you just heard is one of three main building blocks of this final movement. As you heard, it carries that ascending and descending DNA, and it appears 4 times, each one slightly different. The second time it appears, it's brighter. It's in a major key. Time that it appears, it can't quite find where home is. It goes searching through a whole lot of different keys, never really feeling settled. Doesn't know where it's going. The final time, 2 interesting things happen. Suddenly, the music becomes quieter and we're taken back into the sweet romance of the second movement and the key of A-flat major. Then Clara really starts playing around with the tune. You'll hear her take little fragments of the tune and dot them throughout the orchestra. So that's our first building block. The second building block contains, again, those inescapable seeds of upwards and downwards motion, but this time we hear a sequence of downward cascades in the piano before the orchestra replies with a series of ups. Then on top of this, she decides to add in some reminders again of the tune, this time in the bassoon. Listen really carefully. just love those bits where it's bubbling up and down. It sounds so effervescent, like champagne or something. The final building block is a joining piece, and it alerts us that those bubbles are coming next. And as you guessed it, even in the joining material, what goes up must come down. She really likes the up and down idea. Now, if you remember, this is the movement that she actually wrote first. So it's this little passage that probably spurred the very similar music that we heard way back at the beginning of the whole concerto. Way back in the first movement. I have to make them turn lots and lots of pages now. Listen for the piano. She's going to go up, and then down, and then down. She's so economical, isn't she? Just up, down, that's the whole concerto. With these three building blocks, the emphatic Polish dance-like theme, the cascades, and that up and down wave that you just heard, that's just about everything that makes up the final movement. The only thing left is the coda, our wild ride to the finish line. Two measures of a great dramatist are their ability to take your breath away, whether through awe or shock or beauty, and their ability to drive the story to a satisfying conclusion. Clara does both at the end of this concerto. There's a big jump scare before she grips you by the collar and drags you to the end with the wind whistling in your hair. And I think some smoke coming off some fingers, probably. Before we hear the whole last movement of this concerto, let's finally get to the bottom of why Clara and this work were trailblazing for their time. We've mentioned the many unusual devices she used in this piece: the unitary exposition, unusual key choices, our solo cello in the slow movement, the fact it only has one theme, and that there are no breaks between movements. On their own, none of these were original, but it was certainly the first time that they had all been combined together in one piece. I think this comes from the way that Clara was trained. She was given all the tools and techniques by her father, but only so that she could then go and be creative with them and to construct something completely new. We haven't even touched on the remarkable life that Clara led in the 61 years following the premiere of this concerto. After marrying Robert at 18, she bore him 8 children, as you heard earlier, and rejecting the tradition of devoting her life to the home, she instead maintained her own active career, as well as forming a very important musical partnership with Robert as his collaborator, his sounding board, his arranger, and his muse. You could think of them as the first celebrity couple, each equally famous in their own right. When Robert became ill 10 years into their marriage, she was the one that assumed the role of primary breadwinner, in addition to running her home, performing as a soloist, and teaching. Quite ahead of her time, she even negotiated flexible part-time working arrangements at the conservatorium to enable her to balance her responsibilities. Yes, Clara was quite the incredible woman. Later in life, when husband Robert asked her if it was always her choice to perform this concerto that she'd written in her youth, she replied, "Of course, I play it because everyone likes it. Whether it satisfies me personally, that's another question. Do you think me so weak that I don't know very well the shortcomings of this concerto?" Regardless of what she thought, it's still a work of remarkable inventiveness, expression, and excitement. It's hard to believe that she was just 16 when she gave the premiere with the Leipzig Gewandhaus Orchestra and none other than Felix Mendelssohn conducting. To conclude tonight's show, here is the final riveting movement of Clara Wieck's Piano Concerto, performed by Aura Go, Jen Winley, and our fabulous Melbourne Symphony Orchestra. Listen out for that lively dance theme, the twinkling up and down cascades, the wavy joining material before the shock and our breathless race to the end.